Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Red Gaming Technical video, we're going to be starting out our Zen Technical Analysis. This is part 1, of course. Now, this is going to be a series because at different points throughout the year, AMD are going to be releasing a lot more information, no doubt, on Zen. So at the moment, we have an overview of how the CPU is going to work, and this information is naturally going to be a lot more than what we had previously. So we're going to use that as a foundation and then move forward as more information is unveiled. Now, in this video I'm going to keep things fairly simple with my in-depth technical analysis and explanations. So the information will be presented as AMD do, but then if I come to explain something, I'm going to do things in the least technical way possible to at least give people, the widest audience, an understanding of what's changed. Obviously, if you know a lot more about the processor, you can go through the slides anyway and understand it naturally, but I want to once again appeal to the widest audience possible because I've had so many people asking me to tell them what Zen actually is. It would be unfair for me to, go super technical and then for those folks to not understand it. Or at least some of those folks to not understand it. Let me speak correctly. So, first things first. The CEO and president of AMD, Dr. Lisa Su, has claimed that Zen is, and I quote, the most competitive product lineup in a decade when it comes to their processors, of course. While Mark Papermaster, who is the company's senior vice president and CTO, chief technical officer, has described the CPU as, and I quote, a quantum leap in core execution capability and delivering dramatic gains in single-threaded performance, end quote. By the way, this is also an article which you can find linked in, of course, the video description. However, all of those claims from AMD are pretty cheap, and anyone can say something, but ultimately it comes down to one thing. What can the processor deliver in a real-world scenario? Well, they did recently show off a benchmark comparing a 3 GHz Zen processor, which is based upon Summit Ridge as far as my understanding goes, up against a comparable Intel CPU, which is the i7-6900K, also running at 3 GHz, because once again Zen is at an engineering sample stage, not a final retail solution stage. And basically Zen kept up with the i7. It was slightly beating the i7 by just a hair. But that isn't really the story here. The fact that it actually caught up and matched Intel for the most part is very, very impressive. There are some questions this raises, and we'll go into those as the video progresses. But for now, let's talk about how it managed to actually accomplish this, how AMD have managed to achieve such a radical difference compared to their older architecture. So, AMD have released a basic Zen block diagram, as well as some other slides. And one of the primary changes they've made, and this is a pretty obvious one, is the MicroOp Cache. Now, this is pretty simple. Its role is to cache instructions as they are decoded. So when a new instruction is grabbed, the MicroOp caches it, and then the CPU can double check to see if this instruction is already being stored in this cache. And in essence, it reduces the workload on the CPU's front end and also reduces the power consumption of the processor because the front end doesn't have to keep doing the same tasks that has already been done. Now, unfortunately, there are some details on this that are a bit questionable, such as how it's actually achieving this, whether there is some specific algorithm they've managed to implement which has improved the... Is there some specific method that they're implementing here which is different from the traditional? Bear in mind, Intel have had this for some time, even Sandy Bridge, for example, had this, but this is pretty new for AMD. And unfortunately, just like branch prediction enhancements, it's pretty vague on what they've done. Now, the purpose of branch prediction is a pretty simple concept, and if you're even slightly familiar with programming at a basic level, you're going to be able to understand what this is. It's basically life. It's basically you predicting what you need. So, basically, when programming language is created, you typically have a structure. So, basically you would have something like an if, a then, or an else. It's almost the equivalent of you having plans of, let's say, dinner. So if you're asking Bob, hey Bob, did you want to go, to the movies and catch, the latest Batman movie or whatever, and he says no, where you think, well, if Bob isn't going to do that, then what else can I do? Do I go alone, or do I go, find someone else to go with? It's a pretty simple idea. What the CPU is doing here, at least tries to do, is to guess which answer the application will choose ahead of time, and therefore it can basically improve the flow of data from the RAM, from the system's memory, to the processor's caches and, well, other parts of the CPU. If it works well, it reduces program stalls, so basically the actual CPU pipeline can be a lot smoother. Now this does work as well rather nicely with the SMT, simultaneous multi-threading, but we'll go more into that in just a moment. Now, Zen comes down to decoders, which in simple terms converts the instructions that the CPU is retrieving from the system's memory, and then converts those into signals which the CPU itself can use to actually execute those instructions. Bear in mind there are multiple different execution units on the CPU, and each of those works in different ways. Now, from what we can tell with the diagram, it's appearing like AMD have chosen to have separate scheduling units for both integer and floating point workloads. Unfortunately, it's only a theory right now, because ultimately I don't have a Zen engineering sample and there's not enough information for us to really call it one way or another. But what it should theoretically mean is that AMD's approach will allow for wider core processing and a more parallel processing structure. Now, what that basically means is, given the fact that AMD are working towards SMT, simultaneous multi-threading once again, it should mean that the flow of data around the processor is a lot better when dealing with either floating point instructions or integer instructions. So, in short, the CPU should be much, much better at executing things based upon what those instructions are. And it's kind of interesting, and I'm kind of excited about it. Unfortunately, most of this comes down to the actual efficiency of the design, the various caches, the buffers, and all of the other bits and bobs which come into actually making the processor. And once again, we come down to the sorry, not enough information phase, which hopefully we should be able to fill out more by part 2. What we do know, however, is a couple of numbers which do point to the fact that there should be some vast improvements. The first is a 75% increase, which is the 1.75 touted on the instruction scheduler window, which basically means that you have a more effective order of operations. This once again means that the CPU should be more efficient when it actually comes to ordering those operations and prioritizing them, and a 50% wider issue width. So this once again should be better for executing and making use of the resources which are available on the processor. Now, if you've read all of that, or listened to all of that, I'm sorry, I'm going from a script here as well somewhat, so I might make the odd slight fuck up, but I can only apologise profusely. If you're listening to all of this and thinking to yourself, well, what the hell does that all mean? Basically it means that Zen has been radically redesigned. The older designs of the bulldozer architecture are gone, and basically we're looking at a CPU which has been designed for multi-threading and performance of single core, and also much more energy efficient. For example, even a look at the level 1 cache of Zen, you can see that it's been massively improved. We're looking at double the size and increased associativity. Now, I don't really want to get into what associativity is, because it's a pretty complex subject to explain, to be honest. I would suggest, if you're unfamiliar with it, you look at Wikipedia or something similar if you want to know. For the purpose of this video, you probably don't need to know that information, but all it basically means is that if you have a two-way associative cache, it means that any set location in memory can be cached in 2 locations of that cache. If that is way too much information for you, once again, you don't really need to know it for the purpose of this video. I'm just reading out for the technically inclined. And then per Zen core, you have a 64 KB 4-way for instruction, and the level 1 data has a 32 KB 8-way. Level 2 cache has 512 kilobytes, and that is per core. The part that's a bit confusing, and unfortunately we don't have enough information on because I'm hearing slightly different reports from different sources, comes down to the level 3 cache. So regular viewers / readers will know that you have 8 megabytes per 4 Zen cores. You can think of it as like a module, and that's great. Unfortunately, there's a bit of ambiguity when it comes to how that cache works. So some folks are thinking that it's almost like each processor has a walled garden approach. So each core has 2 megabytes available to it, and there's no discussion between those caches. So let's say, for the sake of argument, core 0 calculates 1 plus 1, and then later, and it stores it in a set part of level 3 cache. Later on, core 2 needs that information. What is 1 plus 1? And it knows that it's in. Does it know that it is in core 0's cache, or does it have to calculate this itself? Once again, there is ambiguity on whether this cache is essentially unified. So once again, whether the processors can communicate with it. The main point AMD would probably like you to focus on is the 5 times cache bandwidth to a core. However, it's rather interesting whether we're going to see that that unification or not. So let's talk about Zen and 14nm. 14nm is naturally the shrinking of the size of the, well, silicon. Basically, the smaller it is, the more power efficient, the faster, theoretically, you can clock processors, and basically it means you can pack more transistors into the same space, which is a pretty simple concept. This is not to be confused with FinFET. So a lot of folks actually believe 14nm and FinFET are one and the same, but they're not. So FinFET actually stands for Thin Field Effect Transistor. The too long didn't read of this is that the conducting channel of the silicon is wrapped in a thin silicon fin. Now what this wrap does is help to, well, better control the channel itself and reduce leakage of the actual processor. This basically means that you can get away with less energy consumption, and it's theoretically just a better overall processor, and we're starting to definitely see the shift towards them, and AMD have certainly embraced them. In fact, it's pretty fair to say that they've embraced power efficiency for some time now. I mean, for example, when we reviewed the Athlon X4 8405, which is based on the Carrizo core, we noted that yes, there were some IPC gains, so basically instructions per clock improvements, but it was really the power consumption and low power consumption that was most impressive, and it was a great budget CPU for the money, and I stand by that. However, AMD supposedly were drilling into their engineers for Zen that we need power efficiency. Bear in mind, Zen is not just a case of, oh, okay, well, it's for desktop, oh, okay, it's for this. It's for a multitude of different usage scenarios, whether it's servers, whether it's low power devices, whether it's for the desktop, and AMD have to market the processor based upon this. Now, one of the ways they've done this, and we don't have all of them by any stretch of the imagination, is that they have utilized the MicroOp, which once again reduces the power of the CPU because of the inherent caching. Another method that they're using is clock gating, but we have once again less information on this than what would be an ideal scenario. All we know is that they are pursuing it aggressively. That's one of their quotes, supposedly, and all this does is, well, it's been around for some time. Even Intel were using it back in Pentium 4. It basically only activates the clocks in a certain logic block, in other words, a certain portion of the CPU, when there's work to actually be accomplished by that particular part of the CPU. So in short, there's no point. It's almost like turning on the bathroom light if you're not in the toilet and you're just, downstairs watching a movie. You might as well switch it off and save the power so that your electricity bill isn't as much. One of the talking points of Zen, and definitely one of the more interesting factors, is SMT, or simultaneous multi-threading. Jesus, I'm having one of those days. The easy way, the cop-out way, and definitely one that I'm using, so I'm as guilty as anyone, is to draw a point of comparison with Intel's HyperThreading. Basically, the purpose here is that each core, each physical core, executes 2 or more threads. Now, the operating system and any applications that you are running won't really be able to tell the difference between those 2 cores. While everyone brings Intel to the mix because it's probably the most infamous with HyperThreading, which obviously was introduced back in Pentium 4 days, slight bonus bit of information, one of the reasons they actually created it was because the pipeline of the Pentium 4s was so long. They had a very long pipeline to increase the Pentium 4's clock speeds. They originally thought they were going to get to 10 gigahertz, which of course they fell way short of that. They got to around 40% of that clock. And basically they decided, because the P4's pipeline was so damn long, they had time to basically start another thread. And that's where HyperThreading really was introduced when it came to Intel. But back to this. Intel, however, are not the only ones to have SMT. In fact, if you were to own an Xbox 360, or even a PS3, because the basic core inside the Xenon and the Cell are very similar. Those systems are non-Intel systems, but they do support HyperThreading, or multi-threading to be more accurate. The Xbox 360 features a IBM Xenon CPU, which is clocked at 3.2 GHz, just for your FYI, and has 3 symmetrical cores, and each of those is capable of handling 2 threads. So that's 3 times 2 equals 6, and those are available to games and the operating system accordingly. There is certainly a lot of considerations which one must have in mind when designing a processor which is SMT orientated, because what you don't want is to have insufficient amounts of cache, insufficient amounts of other resources, and basically have the 2 threads conflicting with one another to the point where the purpose of having multi-cores is completely and utterly null and void. In a Disneyland scenario, what you'll have is that both cores or both threads complement one another. And let's say you have a natural gap in the core's utilization, which does happen. It doesn't matter how efficient the processor is you design. You're going to have issues with branch prediction. You're going to have issues with memory storage. You're going to have issues with bandwidth. You're going to have issues with goodness knows what. And basically, at one point or another, the workload of that processor is going to stall, because a processor can only execute a thread can only execute one process, or rather one instruction at a time. So what it does is it orders those threads in the most efficient way possible. In a theoretical world, with multi-threading such as this, you will have this beautiful scenario where, okay, there's a stall, next thread can execute via the scheduler, and vice versa. So the scheduler will schedule the things to be executed based upon the data that's coming in, and in a theoretical world you should have a much better synergy. Whether that comes to fruition or not, we don't know yet. At the end of the day, we're not testing it, but in a theory it doesn't have, and that would be a 2 threads such as this won't have the performance of, let's say, if Zen was truly a 16-core processor, and this goes, by the way, for Intel or any other processor, but it does bring things to the table. Traditionally, I've always said it's about 40 to 60% improvement, depending on a multitude of different factors, including the CPU's architecture, the application, the operating system, the memory, drivers, what it's actually driving. For example, is it CPU dependent? Is it GPU dependent? God knows what. There's a whole bunch of different things which really go into the final countdown, if you will. So this video, as I'm recording this, is about 20 minutes of audio, and there's a good possibility that you're still thinking to yourself, well, gee, that tells me a lot of basic stuff about Zen, that tells me the ins and outs of some of the workloads of how the processor works, but what it doesn't tell me is if I've got X processor, should I hold fire? Should I upgrade? Should I, should I just buy Skylake 6700K, or should I just wait? Should I buy a Broadwell E or wait? Unfortunately, AMD probably couldn't tell you that answer, because they probably have an inkling of what clock speeds they can get to, but ultimately they probably don't know the final retail production speeds yet, and that really is what they're probably testing, as well as maybe doing a few bug fixes. What I can tell you is that if the early benchmarks we're seeing of the engineering sample Zen running against an i7-6900K are any indication of the rest of the performance of the processor, we can make a pretty compelling argument that Zen is going to be impressive. What, however, then comes to mind is a couple of questions. The first, the most logical one, is what Intel are going to be bringing out as of the time of Zen's release. And even if, let's say, for the sake of argument, Intel bring out something which is 10% faster, which is a typical IPC improvement per generation of Intel CPUs, does it actually matter? Now, I know what you're going to say, of course it matters, it's faster. Well, yeah, but it also comes down to a multitude of other things. If Kaby Lake is, let's say, 10% faster per core, or per thread, but Zen has an additional, let's say, 4 cores and therefore 8 threads available to it, and the pricing is similar, or let's say Broadwell E or its successor released at the same time. We don't know, obviously, the release schedules yet, but let's say Broadwell E or its successor is released. Let's say its successor, and the successor is 10% faster than Broadwell E. Well, you might argue that Zen is still possibly going to be a better buy for many gamers if the pricing is correct. And really it comes down to the pricing of Summit Ridge. I'm not focused on server market or low power market here. I'm focused primarily on desktop. If the processor is cheap enough, and if the actual platform, that would be the CPU, sorry, the motherboard, and a decent motherboard which is AM4 related, which works really well with Zen and has good overclocking functionality, which is another factor, well, it is arguable. I mean, personally, for my own usage scenarios, and I can only speak for myself, I would rather have a core which is 10% slower on average, assuming the clock speeds of the processors are roughly equal, but have an additional 50% of cores. That's just me because of the applications I'm running. And let's face it, if you're going with high-end gaming, which, let's face it, if you're going to be buying a processor, a Zen processor for gaming, there's a good chance you're going to be pairing it with a high-end Radeon or a high-end GeForce. One can make a very compelling argument that typically you're going to run into GPU-bound scenarios anyway. So, is 10% going to make the difference? Probably not. I don't know. In which case, however, that's down to you. Now, I know I've probably said like almost 5 minutes of stuff that's kind of thinking, well, I don't bloody know what the hell to do now, and you're probably not the only one. Realistically, AMD have gotten our attention. That would be you, that would be me, that would be members of the press, that would be just, Joe who wants to buy an upgrade to his PC. And it's really for them to keep our attention in a positive light. And that would be for them to keep releasing information and for them to actually show us stuff which makes us want to buy the processor. Now, ultimately, it once again comes down to price, performance, release date, competition, compatibility. For example, is there going to be any issues with the motherboards? Are there going to be issues? Like, for example, I was one of the folks who bought a Sandy Bridge. God, it almost slipped from my mind there. A Sandy Bridge processor, 2500K, and the motherboard. The very early revisions had issues with some of the SATA controllers, and it balked. It did take a year or two for that to happen, but still, it just happened, and it was an issue with early revisions of those motherboards. Is it going to happen more? We don't know. All we can do is wait, but it's very exciting stuff. But with all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. Do the normal like, subscribe, share, give internet cookies, and all of that stuff, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves, guys and girls. Bye for now.